Hi, welcome all. Good morning. Welcome to the latest webinar by Women in Football. We're all grateful to our members. As you all know, we have started this series as a response to COVID-19, and the uptake has been amazing. Within the first 30 minutes we put out any webinar announcement, it's gone. And I think this one went even quicker than half an hour. We all hope that you're finding these series informative and engagement, and I'm really happy to present three amazing women that I'm proud to call also my friends today. First of all, I want to thank Moya, Amanda and Laura for joining us, taking the time to talk to you all. And let me introduce Moya first, who will be our host today. She's the former vice captain of the Australia's women's national team, Matildas, and she was one of the first women to join the board of FIFA back in 2013 and served for 3 years, and she's still on the player status committee. And also she serves on the court for arbitration for sport, and she's the chair of Common Goal. Welcome, Moya.
Thank you.
Next, joining Moya is Amanda Vandervort, and she's another former player who turned coach. And she has carved out a career as a sports business executive with a track record for leadership and innovation, stretching across all areas of the game. She's currently the Chief Women's Football Officer at FIFPro, and before that she was the Vice President of Fan Engagement at MLS in the US. She served as the President of United Soccer Coaches, the largest coaches association in the world, and is currently on the boards of several NGOs trying to transform the community through football. Welcome, my dear Amanda.
Thank you, Ebro. It's great to be here.
And completing the trio is another co-conspirator, Professor Laura McAllister. She's a former international footballer and sports administrator. And as an international for Wales, she won 24 caps and served as team captain. She's currently Professor of Public Policy and Governance of Wales at the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University. She's a board member at the FA of Wales Trust and Deputy Chair of UEFA's Women's Football Committee and a former board member of UK Sport. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you very much, April. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn off my microphone and my video and hand it over to Moya, and I'll join you again at the end of the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome, and thank you all for joining us. I think you're in for a rollicking good hour of debate and discussion with Laura and Amanda. And I'm not sure how I got to be in the middle of this and be the boss of you two, but I'm going to enjoy it for the next hour. So thank you very much for the opportunity, Ebru, and for that very kind introduction. First of all, a couple of housekeeping things. Most importantly, the chat, because this is, we're hoping this can be a little interactive, and I'm sure you'd like to hear your questions answered by the two geniuses that we have with us. So feel free to introduce yourself on the chat. Please select all attendees in the chat and say who you are, what you do and where you're from. And of course, keep it polite and respectful and positive. So as context, very briefly, COVID. It happened. Professional sport went off a cliff, and we are now starting to see men's sport climb back up. Women's sport, not so much. It varies around the world, but we know the WSL is off. The EPL is scrambling to come back on. In Australia, here in Australia, we saw the Australian Rules Football League abandon their women's competition very quickly, almost without a second thought. While the men, again, are scrambling to get back. And we're seeing this pattern repeated around the world. Although the Bundesliga, both are back, but in France and Holland, both are off. So there's different patterns around the world, but there's not too many places where the women are doing better than the men. So we thought to kick all this off, we'd start to unpack what you see as the underlying reasons for this. I know we've all, had been mansplained on Twitter as to why this is the case. But I just want to hear, first of all, from Laura and then from Amanda, what COVID has meant for you, what you've been doing during COVID, and why you think this is affecting women's sport in the way it is. Laura.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much, Moya. Yeah, it's one of those moments, isn't it, I think, in general terms for our society, where it's a pause, clearly, and it's an opportunity, but it's also a massive risk. And I think that applies to everything from sport to politics to equality to all forms of social organisation. But I'm I'm quite an optimistic person, and I think when you have such a moment of pause and reflection, I think it's incumbent on all of us who have some authority or voice, for that matter, to think through how we'd like sport, and in this case, women's sport and women's football, to come back better and stronger. Because I think before coronavirus, we were all very conscious that we'd made some really significant strides for the women's game in every country, here in Wales, in England, across the United Kingdom, Europe and beyond. But I think those moments are actually quite perilous ones as well, regardless of coronavirus, because once you get to the point where women are visible, where women's football is, let's just say, more populist, I think that's when you usually get a backlash or a vulnerability as well. So in some ways, this does give us a chance to think about how we want to rebuild women's sport more generally, but in this case, women's sport, with more sustainable foundations and with better access to power and authority. And I think for me, that's, apart from looking after my two girls who are 2 and 6, so you can imagine having them at home whilst working full time is not easy. But apart from that, I've been giving some thought to how we might actually use this crisis as an opportunity to have a better game when we come out the other end.
Thank you. Amanda, you're at FIFPro, so you've been looking down the barrel at most of these issues and no doubt hearing from distressed players from around the world as they're seeing their generally much more modest incomes be cut in the women's game. What has been keeping you busy? And give us a little bit of perspective on what you see as the biggest underlying issues here for the women's game.
Yeah, thanks, Moya and Laura. It's great to hear your perspective, and certainly a great intro to this conversation. And also, I'm watching all the people popping up in the attendee list, and it's just fabulous to see everyone who's in here. So I know we said at the beginning, if you have questions, chuck them into the chat. And I just want to underline that, because I think, one of the key things that we're talking about here is our entire community coming together around solutions, and certainly that's everyone from those of us in positions of influence and power, to those of us who are players and or fans experiencing the game. And I think everyone's different perspective is going to help us create the most impactful movement going forward, and like Laura said, creating a sustainable foundation and bringing back the game in innovative and smart ways. So I guess for me, that's a starting point, is this kind of collaboration, an idea of coming together. So, and that was our call to action at FIFPro. We, if you actually, I think maybe a timeline is an easy way, Moya, for me to answer your question, what we've been up to at FIFPro. So we actually have a study that we published on the 30th of April called Raising Our Game. And it's a look at the economy of women's football, honestly, right up until coronavirus happened. So we partnered with KPMG over the duration of 2019 to look at the economic conditions of the game, women's football, and how, and our hypothesis was that women's football was on the rise, and the economic growth of the game was certainly transpiring. And that's what we found, from attendance to broadcast to sponsors. So we published that report on April 30th. But prior to its publication, so it's the economic growth, it's the conditions of players within the game itself, and the acknowledgement that within the economic growth of the game, the conditions of players are still stagnant. And so it's our responsibility, actually, as the game evolves and grows, to consider the conditions of the workers, the players themselves, within that context of growth. So that led to our call to action, which is what we'll talk about today from a FIFPro perspective. What is that call to action? Which involves, as I started, a collective agreement and understanding on how to move forward. But before we publish that, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, give us a little thumbnail of the Raising Our Game report, because you must have written this thing, and I bet it said, you know, women's sport is getting stronger and we're seeing crowds grow and all of this kind of cautious optimism that we feel for the game. And then, you know, you kind of just went off a cliff. And so give us a thumbnail of what the report says, and then there's probably a COVID postscript to that, and then what it means going forward in this new environment.
Yeah, broadly speaking, the report details that growth was happening, right? On the back of the Women's World Cup, which we saw attendance, we saw incredible broadcast and especially digital numbers with people engaging around the world in women's football like we haven't seen before. And we've seen new sponsors come into the game, whether it's Barclays, you know, here in England, to and with women in football, as a matter of fact, to Visa and UEFA and other sponsors around the world. So we're seeing that growth and evolution happening. But players themselves are still largely in precarious positions. I think there's probably a spectrum for us to talk about in terms of what we see with players, from a very maybe well-recognized, well-supported group of professionalized athletes to amateurs in the women's game, who, by the way, actually do feature in our global international competitions. In fact, one of our findings was that of the players that we surveyed for our 2019 study, who were all national team players, this was in the context of national team and World Cup playing players, 3.6% of them said that they don't get paid at all. So that would put them quite clearly in an amateur category. And I think that that's like the other end of the spectrum. And then in the middle, we have so many variations of players with contracts, without contracts. Some are getting paid, some aren't, and every kind of space in between that. So really for us, when we start to look at recommendations and a call to action in this report, it comes down to creating standards across this spectrum so that we can have an expectation that female footballers can compete as elite athletes at the highest level. And what does that mean in terms of their conditions and in terms of what we're providing them as professional athletes? Which, Moya, to your point, takes us back to the COVID-19 introduction, right?
Yeah, because you know, you put out a pretty, what became just a statement that was taken up and reported throughout the world. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we, on April 16th, I think it was, we published a paper on the implications of COVID-19 on women's professional football. And keep in mind, April 16th, we didn't know what way coronavirus was going, but we did see the pause in play around the world. And we looked at what our research had told us. We did a study in 2017 on the employment conditions of female players, and then we did this 2019 study with KPMG for Raising Our Game. And we looked at these conditions and recognized that in the absence of contracts, a lot of players don't have safety precautions for keeping their jobs. In the absence of other conditions like health and safety being considered in return to play as a standardized condition in which players deserve to be recognized, things like this weren't, there's no standard. So we recognized this and yeah, we put out a statement on the 16th, more like a paper, in April that said women's football potentially faces an existential threat if we don't.
That was the headline. That was the headline we all saw: existential threat.
Yeah, if we don't come together as a community and address these shortcomings in the game for players, for stakeholders, everyone. But it's not a simple solution. We have to come together as a community to address these shortcomings, so that when we do come back to play, we're stronger than we were before, and players are protected.
So maybe we can just unpack some of the underlying differences that women footballers face. I know that often they've got much shorter term contracts, the seasons are shorter, obviously the salaries are shorter, and the transfer system doesn't provide them with the same sort of, there's not the same money flows in the transfer system in the women's game, which means that all the pyramid underneath them is perhaps less, there's not money flows around it the way we see it in the men's game. Laura, what do you see as the biggest impediments for the women standing for themselves in COVID, in the COVID situation? I mean, we don't go into COVID in the same situation as the men. So, you know, do you see any opportunity there for us to come out better than we went in? Because it's not looking like that right now, I guess.
I think there's always opportunities to improve things, particularly in periods of crisis. But, you know, I think we've got to be realistic here. You know, the women's professional game is a very, very small element of women's football. You know, we know there's only half a dozen significant, serious professional leagues in the world. And the rest of us are doing our best to create a pyramid of development for the game that starts from the very basic level, you know. And I mean, for me particularly, and this has been a little bit of a personal journey for me, you know, having been a player myself. When I'm a player who didn't go into coaching, unlike some of the rest of you, but because I thought governance in sport was a better synergy with my academic interests. But you know, one thing that's occurred to me straight away, having been involved with the elite side of the game, is how much the elite side of the game depends on a really strong grassroots. And so more of my attention, if anything now, is on really early interventions in football. And it's probably the area I care most about now, because I can see with my own children that if we don't get this right for really early years education, because I think schools are the site of change, basically, then I think we're going to just continue to hemorrhage girls out of football or never get them in the first place. So I think we've got to be realistic when we reinvent our narrative about what women's football is all about. For me, it has to be a real investment in the very earliest experiences of girls in the game, because if we don't get that right, quite frankly, we'll potter along with 6 or maybe 12 in the next decade professional leagues, but underneath we'll effectively be standing on sand, you know, and we know the dangers involved in that. So I'd hope that we invent a narrative, or we write a narrative for ourselves now that is based on an effective structure for the women's game, all the way from early interventions through grassroots, through community, right the way up to the players who, even in the next decade, won't be on full-time contracts, but will have some kind of mix, as Amanda and yourself described, but not excluding, obviously, the very elite players who we need to look after. And the work that Amanda and FIFPro does is crucial in that.
You know what's interesting, Laura, too, when we talk about like those development structures, there are elite level players playing at all of those different levels. And it's on the women's side, right? Like there's women players playing at what we might consider an amateur developmental level in some of these countries around the world, but they are elite players who feature on the global stage at the Women's World Cup. So when you are talking about these systems, it's not just, especially in the women's game, that at the top brass are the players, you know, at the World Cup. They're throughout the system. So it couldn't be more critical.
I think you're right. And I mean, I don't know if you agree, Amanda, but, you know, I think we need to kind of recast the football ecosystem so that we stop trying to imitate the men's game and assume that there is a professional tier to the men's game and then Sunday league players, as we'd call it in the United Kingdom, you know, pub type players. It's not like that in the women's game. As you rightly say, you know, there are players in countries across the world who don't get paid a penny and are probably paying to play and yet are the elite players. So I think we've got to be cognizant of the fact that women's football is at a different stage of maturity everywhere in the world. And we only get stronger by strengthening the weakest link, in effect. So I don't think we can afford to go into a scenario which has happened with the men's game, where the very top of the game has almost drifted apart from the rest of the game. And I think we've created a pretty horrible beast in men's football as a result of that. And I'd hope that we don't do the same in the women's game.
Well, it's interesting because, and Moya, I'm sorry, I know you've probably got questions, but I think Laura and
Chat away.
here for the next 5 minutes, because it's when we think about Yeah, when we think about the differences, and I know, Moya, we kind of opened up talking about the differences in men's and women's football, and I think we can learn a lot from the men's game, right? And what I started talking about with raising our game, one of the big epiphanies for me as I went through it was actually thinking back about the economic growth of men's football, and were the conditions of male players considered within that growth? And recognizing today, where are we? Where are those players? Because maybe their conditions weren't considered in the rise of the economy, right? And that's put us in the men's game in a quite challenging place, as you've just pointed out, with the top of the top. And then there's a lot of separation, and there's terrible things that happen across the men's game. We can talk about racism and discrimination and things like that because the systems didn't facilitate diversity and inclusion in decision-making processes throughout that growth period, right? So here we are today, where on the women's side, we're lucky. We've identified this at the beginning of the economic growth, and we can say, hang on, we're at the beginning of this. We recognize it. Yes, it is happening. The data has proven that the women's game is growing, and we have the opportunity now to interject and create those systems and structures so that there is diversity, inclusion in decision making, and a long-term, I guess, strategic approach to ensuring that there are standards across that entire spectrum.
One big difference, though, that we've never had the benefit of being the entire focus of the people in charge. The women's game has never had the benefit of that. And the men's game, of course, even though if you turn the clock back 100 years, we didn't have the same, occupational health and safety standards that we do now. There were all sorts of things that the men's game faced in those early years that didn't have the benefit of the modernised technology or the insights that we now have. But at least they had the full attention of those who governed them. Now, isn't this one of the most fundamental challenges that we face, is that there's people, and I see they've got plenty of people here from the Premier League on today. There's people sitting in the Premier League offices, and their sole focus is the Premier League. They've had a bit of a look over the fence at women's football. They haven't taken it on yet. But likewise, the FA has a lot to do in men's football as well as in women's football. And it's not very often that you see that women's football actually takes the first priority. Isn't that one of the most fundamental challenges we face? Laura, you're a governance professor. You're probably the best person, the most qualified person on this call to talk about it.
I'm not sure about that.
How do you get governed optimally when you seem to be the second or 10th priority or the any other business item in a meeting? How do we bootstrap ourselves out of that?
I think you've been pretty generous, in all honesty, Moya, to say that we've never had the full attention of football. We've never really had more than maybe 10% of the attention of the governance of football, in my opinion. And I think if you were starting to construct a governance model for the modern game, you wouldn't start from where we are now, but you'd apply that to virtually every sport globally. Sport, in essence, has been created by men to be run for men. So what we're trying to do is modify the edges of that to try and get a voice and a status for women. So it's not an ideal position, but there are things that can be done, I think. And when you start talking about governance, people start drifting off and yawning. But, for me, governance is probably the most fundamental challenge that we all face for the reasons you've mentioned there. We don't own our own narrative of football. We don't have control of how we express the differences between the men and women's game, or even about how we structure its development. So as a result, we're almost getting crumbs off the table of someone else. So we have to change governance. But I think that has to be done in quite a radical way, in my opinion, because, we've been tinkering around the edges of governance in football for the best part of 20, 30 years. And we're still seeing minuscule progress in most countries. I mean, there are exceptions, to be fair. But if you look at where the exceptions are, I think they're to do with the geopolitical culture of those countries. So, obviously in Scandinavian countries, it's different. In the US, as Amanda knows, women and men's football effectively, were not fundamentally and culturally different in the way that they were in the UK. I mean, I can see with my own kids that the girls are being socialised out of football at a very early age because for many people, it's still not seen to be a sport for girls and women. So I think we have to do radical things. What do I mean by radical things? I think we've got to talk about quotas, proper quotas, serious ones. I mean, if it's good enough for FTSE 100 companies, if it's good enough for aspects of political party life, if it's good enough for parliamentary institutions, and I think it's certainly good enough for a sector like sport where women are so hideously underrepresented. And then I think we've got to concentrate on getting women who will serve in a way that isn't always to their benefit, if you know what I mean. So it's not about conforming to the culture of the organisation that they join. It's about agitating and changing and speaking up and being the lift one's head above the parapet contributor. And believe me, and I'm sure all of us can validate this, that's not always an easy place to be. It means you're less popular. It means you get more abuse, maybe just on social media, but you will get more abuse by nature of that. But I think we need to have an ask here as a group of women in football. We need, whether that's 50-50 representation or 40-40-20, whatever it is, we need to be much harder in our ask. And let's challenge people who say that we can't have that. Because I don't think there are very good reasons out there as to why that can't happen, quite frankly. And if there are, I certainly haven't heard them.
Well, letting fly then, thank you. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and I have to tell the women in football folk that you have some gate crashers here from Australia, from the group Women on Side, who have a few attendees, and of course they're very busy on the chat because it's 9 o'clock at night here and they're probably all having a glass of red. But I can tell you too that Women on Side were very involved in lobbying in Australia to get exactly what you talked about, a 40-40-20 quota on the board of the Football Federation Australia and its member bodies. And that's still working its way through the system. And that was drawn down directly from the clauses in the FIFA statutes in the reform process, which talked about gender equality and gave Women on Side a foothold to argue that very strongly and successfully in Australia. But a few questions coming through. First one, Amanda, you probably want to take this one. This has come from Maria at Women on Side, I think. I would have thought FIFA could directly intervene on the matter of national team player payments, at least in regard to World Cup qualifications and finals. Would you want FIFA to act directly on this?
Oh, interesting. Well, FIFA, I mean, Moya, I think you probably know more about the governance and payment structures of FIFA's intervention with federations and what that looks like. The relationship between a federation and player is where the contractual obligations start and where the payments start. So I'm actually interested, Moya, in how you would respond to that question regarding FIFA intervening in those player payments. I mean, certainly as FIFPro, if players aren't getting their payments from their national team as contracted, we certainly welcome players to reach out to us. That's one of our core competencies, I would say, from a legal perspective, is supporting player claims and helping players in that instance. But regarding FIFA, Moya, do you have a point of view on that?
Well, FIFA is a member-driven organisation. So
Yeah.
What matters is members and their votes. And so the prize money, just as it does in the Olympics, it's not even prize money in the Olympics, it's allocations of money, the broadcast money from these big tournaments goes to those federations. And I think the payment to the players has always depended on what kind of deal those players get with the federations. If they can, if they're unionised or if they're strong and they're negotiating, they're able to get a good deal and get a good chunk of the money. If they're not, then who knows where it goes. It depends on the transparency of reporting in that country. I think, players have always drawn most of their money from club football. I'm pretty sure Neymar didn't get paid a lot to play for Brazil in the World Cup.
On the men's side, right?
Yeah, on the men's side.
That's the difference. Women are in a different situation, right?
Because club football,
most of their income.
Right, because club football is less developed. And I actually think this is the next big thing. This is the next big thing in football, is women's club football. And that's where I think we will get, well, hopefully we'll get more stability, more even spread, growth of opportunities for talent. I think that's would make a bigger difference than FIFA paying directly to World Cup players, because let's face it, a payday once every 4 years isn't going to pay the bills. So that's where I would put that. Do you have a perspective, Laura?
Not strict.
Former captain of Wales?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously we're in a different position in Wales in terms of our development, but clearly I think there is a kind of trickle down effect in all of this. It affects some of the smaller countries, with a less developed club structure, but still gets entry into the Champions League and so on, and beyond. But I think we've just got to be very careful with all of this, that we don't allow the elite club side of the game to drift off from the rest of the club game, because I think in most countries, really, as I said earlier, in most countries these areas are quite close together, and we can't afford to sort of create distinguishing barriers between the very top of the game where payments are given and the level just below and the level just below that, because I think that would be detrimental long term to the growth of the game.
Yeah, I think to wrap up on answering that question, I think it is a question. I think there's an answer regarding ensuring that payments between players and federations are achieved, that players get their money, right, for services rendered, whether that's from like FIFA prize money that gets delivered through the federation to the players, or contractual relationship between the player and the federation. I do think, broadly speaking, there's an opportunity for us if we're looking at thinking about the game differently. I do think there's an opportunity to have a global dialogue about how professional female football players are remunerated. Like how can a player, the system in the men's game is that club is where you make your money, and national team they make money there at the national team, but certainly there's an element of pride, right? While we're playing for the national team. And in the women's game, pride don't pay the bills. Right. So we got to find a way as a global community to make sure that women who are playing at the elite level can sustain careers as professionals, both across club and national team. And I think that's where the interesting conversation can really be brokered, is what is the relationship between international football and club football, and how do we look at that differently, maybe in the women's game than the men's game, because remuneration and financial considerations might be coming from different places.
Well, it's interesting. We have a question from Bethany, who says, how important is investment from broadcasters and sponsors to support the awareness of the women's game? And I guess we have to see that in the context of coming out of COVID as well right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this is an opportunity again. I mean, of course, it's a massive threat, because lots of us have seen, big sponsors freeze contracts or request different provision, because obviously there's been no actual play in this period. But I think, again, taking a more optimistic appraisal of this, I think this creates an opportunity for us to talk differently about the value of the women's game, that isn't just economic. Because I think if we frame the value of the women's game purely in terms of, as you said at the beginning, Moya, attendances, payments, salaries and so on, we're fighting a losing battle, because that's not where the women's game is. But if we talk about the ethics of the women's game, the fact that it is more family oriented, the fact that you see some great football and you can take your kids along and it's cheap and it's fun and it's enjoyable. The fact that our female players are fantastic role models. I mean, we've got people like Jess Fishlock and Sophie Ingle in Wales, and every kid in Wales knows who these girls are, and they're right up there with the top male athletes. And when you're a small country, hey, believe me, you've got to make the most of your top athletes. But they set the right impression, they give the right profile, they've got the right principles about how they relate to other kids playing football. So I think we need to sell football differently. I think it's lots of companies out there have got important corporate social responsibility obligations, and I'm not sure the men's game will deliver on all of those in the way that the women's game can. Yeah, indeed. And Amanda, just to put you on the spot a little bit, I know from reading the press, you've been having meetings with FIFA lately. We all think that because of COVID, I mean, my feeling in the early days of COVID, at least, was that the organisations in football who are going to get the upper hand right now are the ones who've got a pile of cash. And nobody's got a bigger pile of cash than FIFA and UEFA, I think, in football. Maybe some
entities where states are heavily involved. They have, deep pockets. But certainly, I think of that big hill on Zurich, and I think of a big treasure chest there with a few $1 billion in it. And I thought, well, as football kind of almost professional football sails over this cliff, that is one place where people might be looking to get get rescued and to resurrect the sport. What are you able to tell us, if anything, about the state of thinking of what FIFA would be able to do? Can women's football get its hand in the big treasure chest in Zurich and support and sustain the professional women's game through this period? Is there any prospect of that? Because what we are seeing is that, apart from maybe in Germany, where there's a solidarity fund that's had the Frauen Bundesliga kick over pretty much in line with the men, we're not really seeing too much of that solidarity, or some people like to call it a cross subsidy, but we're not seeing too much of that heading in the women's direction right now. What are you able to tell us on that?
Well, there is there's a conversation, certainly, and research that is going on at FIFA regarding their member associations and what their needs are in this time. And FIFPro is an active participant in those conversations about the application of that. But I can't speak on behalf of FIFA and what their plans are to do. What I can do is share the things that we're working on with FIFA and where where we see opportunity. I think, and I mean, I appreciate the need for women's football to be considered definitely at the table in the same breath as the men's game in those conversations, and my understanding is that that's what's happening. So that makes me positive, but I haven't seen the specifics of it. So in our conversations with FIFA, we've been talking about conditions, global labor standards, what does the Women's World Cup 2023 look like for players, and what does the match calendar look like coming out of coronavirus, the international match calendar, the implications on that as we move forward. I think that's one of the big concerns that players have raised to us, is the shifts and changes in the match calendar and the impacts that has on them as athletes. So it's a lot beyond the financial.
So you're talking there about the delay of the Euros by a year, and then
and the Olympics being moved,
all the knock-on effects, the delays of World Cup qualifiers, etc.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of there's both the financial aspects and implications like you're talking about, and the delivery of some funding to support the women's game, and then there's also the non-financial aspects that ultimately have the financial downstream effects, right? But there is a lot of shifting and moving and changing in the global football calendar, and those are a lot of the conversations that we're having with FIFA at the moment.
Laura, you talked about shifting the conversation, and I'm seeing a lot of questions piling in here. I'm sorry, I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but there is a very interesting line of questions coming in now about how we value the women's game and how we position it. And Laura, you were touching on some of the opportunities to, I think, reset and revalue the women's game through COVID and maybe come out the other end with something different. And I'm reminded of what happened 100 years ago, which I think is burned in everyone's memory who is part of the women's game, that, 100 years ago, they were getting through the last pandemic. They'd got out of World War I. Women's football had become enormously popular. The men came back from war. Women's football continued to be enormously popular, with tens of thousands of people piling into stadiums. There was a pandemic. There was the Spanish flu. But in 1920, actually, that was that famous 53,000 people in Goodison Park watching Dick Kerr's ladies. And, it's burned in my memory, the photos that you see with tens of thousands of people in those grandstands. And then we know what happened. 1921, women's football gets banned. It's taken us 100 years. And I think we're still not back at that point where women's football is getting the same crowds as men's. I mean, I think actually their crowd was biggest in the women's crowd was biggest in club football in 1920 in England. my sense in this pandemic is that we absolutely cannot repeat what happened at the end of the last pandemic, because coming out of that, women were completely excluded for decades, and even in a century have not made up that gap. What does it look like to use this opportunity to reshape the way that the women's game is valued? You've talked a bit about the governance, but I'd be interested to see hear from both of you on what you think is the formula for revaluing the game, so that, you know, in your ideal world, when we come out of COVID, what does it look like? And some of the questions that have come in are get at this topic. Are we complicit if we accept the argument that women footballers don't deserve equal pay because they don't create the same commercial revenue? Isn't any footballer's job to play football? Commercial revenues are someone else's responsibility. That question's from Lee. Kerry Harris says, when talking about the economics of women's football, let's look at changing the language that women's football is a cost and change it to investment.
Yeah, great.
Oh, I love
Who wants to go first? This is a big topic.
This
is
massive
one of my
topic,
favourite topics. Off you go.
It's a massive topic. I like that last question though, because it reminds me of a comment from Louis Vuitton, the head of the French fashion house. I think he said something along the lines of, value is remembered when price is forgotten. And I think this is where we start with the women's game, in my opinion. We need a manifesto for the women's game that we can all sign up to, you know, from Amanda's FIFPro members right the way down to parents of 3 and 4 year old girls who want their kids to have the same opportunities as boys. But I think we start by revaluing the women's game slightly differently. We also start from the premise of saying that where is the growth potential in football? We know the growth potential is with girls and women. There's not a shadow of doubt over that. You know, we saw a 50% increase in Wales in the girls taking part in football after the men's team reaching the semi-finals of Euro 2016. 50%, that's a pretty big leap. So we can get benefits, of course, from success in the men's game, but we need a structure then to deliver it, and we need a pathway for those girls to come through. But I think we can go back to this value thing. We can use our players as role models to communicate the value of the game really differently, because they're accessible, they're relatable in a way that I think male players are not always. They're passionate about growing their game, you know, and I know that from working with the girls in Wales. You know, they care about the future of the game in a way we all did, of course, as players, but they've got a much bigger profile and a much greater kind of brand awareness now. So we need to use them as our primary ambassadors. But I do think we need to keep knocking on the doors of the confederations as well, and of course of FIFA, to say, you know, this is in everybody's interest. You know, this isn't a battle where somebody's going to lose. This is a battle where both sides can win, actually, because growing the game is in everybody's interest, and the growth potential is with girls and women.
Vandy?
I mean, I underline what Laura's saying about, or cosign times 100, about players feeling passionate and invested in the future of their game. I mean, we see it time and time again from players, both in internal studies and surveys to things that they're posting on social media, right? Like about the power and value of what the game has been to them personally, but to women more broadly in society, and everyone in society, not just women. I mean, this is a collective feature, right? So yeah, I mean, I think you said it really eloquently about the value of the game. If we start to talk about a toolkit, Moya, I would look towards some of the research and calls to action that FIFPro put out. That was our intention with our study, was to start to build the toolkit and put pieces together for the successful growth of the professional women's game, and that involves labor standards. So that's everything from creating training and match environments that are the highest, you know, elite level for professional players, or elite level players that are playing at senior levels, to employment protections, non-discrimination, remedy for players who've been impacted or affected in negative ways. The same that anyone would get in a professional working environment within an office place, or what, like, this is their place of employment, their place of work, and making sure that they're recognized with those rights that come with being a worker first and foremost. And then I think, yeah, this concept of investing, like that's an investment we have to make into players themselves, so that the game can become the elite level that we know and believe that it can. It's been on the path to that, but the more we can help countries in South America and Africa and across Asia and all the confederations, all the regions, improve the quality of play, I think that's also going to begin to attract broadcasters and sponsors and more financial investment into the game as well. If you have a stadium where you can't put up a field board and display a sponsor proudly, or you can't have, you know, multiple camera angles for a professional broadcast of a match, well, that immediately cuts out sponsors and broadcasters from the conversation because they can't display their product. So creating these environments impacts not just players, it's the whole down chain system.
Right. We've got a couple of questions here on brand and profile, really, which I'll just quickly throw at you. How can women's football, such as the FA, attract more brand sponsors like the USA Women's League has? And another, do you worry about a loss of profile gained from the last Women's World Cup with the cancellation of so many leagues, particularly the high-profile ones?
Laura, do you want to address that from a...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not a brand expert by any means, but I think without a shadow of a doubt, there will have been some loss in momentum, and I think that's always risky, you know, because we saw the success of the World Cup, and we're right in the middle of the Euro 21, as was qualifiers for the women's teams here, and clearly they, you know, everything came to a halt. I mean, in Wales, you know, we were seeing sell-out stadia for our qualifying games, and still being in the mix for qualification gave us an enormous boost in terms of our strategic plans. Let's hope that we get there. Let's hope we get to England in 2022. But, you know, it's very hard, isn't it, you know, to keep up that momentum when there's no football being played. And I think going back to my point about girls again, you know, I know that the girls took a huge energy boost from seeing the success of the national team in the qualifiers, and obviously if they're not playing and they're not seeing those girls play, then there's, you know, a bit of a vacuum really. And let's just hope that, you know, that isn't filled by other things really, because we need to keep these girls engaged. We need to promise them a brighter future when we come out of this, not even as good as the one that they, you know, when we went into the crisis.
You know what you're reminding you, the word brand, I think, and then your description kind of behind it reminds me of, you know, I was at Major League Soccer for a decade before I came over to FIFPro, and in 2013 we relaunched our brand. So we had the old MLS logo was a little soccer ball with a black kicking foot and a green and a blue kind of background. And through the process, we had an amazing man at MLS called David Bruce, and he led us through an entire brand discovery process. Basically, it's not just about women's football. It's actually, well, MLS, it wasn't just about men's football as an example. It was, what are the values? What does the industry stand for? What does the company stand for? What are the intangibles that men's professional football in America at that time stand for, both from fans and player perspective, more broadly than just this is a bunch of dudes kicking a ball, right? Okay, so let's look at that in the context of the women's game and have this conversation, which, Laura, I think you're starting to kind of pull out, is what does women's football stand for beyond 22 players kicking a ball on the pitch? Like, there's a lot more to this game, from growth and development to advocacy to the role of females in society, right? And I think those conversations lead me, when I'm thinking about brand, those conversations lead me to have these brand value conversations and start to engage in those with sponsors like Coca-Cola or Adidas or Nike, or these organizations that do have a lot of values of equality and gender diversity built into their governance and their policies. But let's align those with women's football and find ways to elevate the game through multiple kind of stakeholders. Because don't forget, I mean, sponsors are stakeholders too, and they do have these brand values.
Yeah, I mean, you make some really good points there, Amanda, because, you know, in a sense, marketeers and branding experts, you know, have moved on from the more traditional way of selling a product. You know, as you say, it has to be much more value driven, and it also has to be much more ethically right now. In the past, you know, motivations might have been profit and prosperity for shareholders. That's different now. You know, people expect it to be on a much more ethical foundation. And I think the women's game, you know, I mean, I've said it already, but I've got to repeat it. The women's game is a family and community commodity. And that's what makes it unique in terms of its relationship with the men's game. You know, not all of men's football is a family concept, and not all of it is a community concept, certainly not in the UK anyway. And I think, you know, we need to, like anything, dwell on our strengths and not concentrate so much on our weaknesses. I mean, I wrote an article the other day and I said, do you think Gareth Bale practices free kicks with his right foot? No, because he doesn't need to, you know. So let's look at what we're good at in women's football, and that's the ethics and the values and the principles, and let's sell those better, you know, because I think that's a really attractive, compelling offer to broadcasters and sponsors, actually. And the reason we haven't done it yet is because the governance of the game isn't right as well. Going full circle, we don't have women saying that in the most important echelons of power, and I think that's going to trip us up if we're not careful.
Well, I would go a bit further than that and say I think actually that sometimes feels like a bit of a threat to those who hold the power.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, when you see, we've always seen the US women's national team being out in front and demanding equality at levels that most of the rest of the world can only dream about when they're already probably the best paid national team in the world. And, you know, and today, or in the last 24 hours, we've seen Rose Lavelle tweeting about the situation with Black Lives Matter and the shocking scenes we're seeing in the US at the moment. I mean, these things are right out on the edge, and that's not everyone's got the appetite for that in football governance. So I think at one end, you know, there is that level that people are quite comfortable with, and that I think you're right is a real selling point for the game. And on the front end, which is I think where ultimately we need to go, there is still quite a few people who are like, oh, not, you know, you give these women an inch and God, they come and sue you and they want equal pay. It's outrageous, you know. So I think we still find ourselves negotiating those things with the rest of the football community, quite frankly.
Yeah, you're right. But by the way, a point that I meant to make under governance, which I didn't, is that I think we need to support each other when we do get to positions of authority. You know, we need networks like Women in Football, but other networks as well who we can use as sounding boards so that we're not isolated, because I think, you know, that in the foreseeable future there will be just individual women on organizations without a kind of critical mass of other people who think like her, and we need to make sure those people are not isolated, that are not called out for being challenging and critical and different, because that's exactly what the sport needs. But it takes a brave organisation to embrace challenge, quite frankly, and maybe in places we don't have sufficiently brave organisations.
Absolutely. A couple of questions. I know we're running down the clock a little bit, but Amanda,
no,
one
watching
for
them,
you.
they're flying in over here every time.
I know. There's just
more
we
messages.
could be here.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Thank you, everyone, for being so
listening.
interactive.
I'm fully engaged, but again, the community, I do love seeing everyone commenting. Sorry, go on.
There's one with your name on it here, Vandy. How will FIFPro be working with UEFA around their minimum player standards objective in the time for action strategy? And how will FIFPro support and advise national associations around best practice and player agreements, with the different countries being at very different stages? And then I will also throw in a second question here that's come in from Kate. How can clubs and the FA innovate to ensure the same pick-up in interest? So that's a more generalised question for you as well, Laura. But Vandy, you first.
Yeah, UEFA, the question is, how are we working with UEFA? And then the other one was federations, right? How do we work with federations?
And that's in the context of women's football being in a pause and then not being restarted until well into September seems to be the guess, and the loss of momentum. So how do you innovate your way out? Can you innovate your way out of this pause? So that's the second question. Over to you.
Yeah. Okay, let me start. Let me start with UEFA. I actually think it's a broad conversation across all of the confederations. So keep in mind, FIFPro is the global body for player unions. So We have a really strong relationship with UEFA. We have bilateral conversations with them on a number of issues. So we have shared with them the Raising Our Game report, and I've been on with them now talking through the call to action within the report. And so we have some next working steps to really dig into the report itself and pull out some of the data and insights to really talk to UEFA specifically about the application of it within their region, because we have member unions throughout the world and a number of them in Europe. So we're starting to build a really positive working relationship with UEFA as a starting point. So I would kind of say it's UEFA, but we've had conversations with the women's football leadership in AFC and CAF, and we're working on organizing with the others as well. So for me, it is a global dialogue, and it's an important one for us to create common understanding about what we're talking about when we talk about labor standards and what the application of that might look like in Poland versus Germany versus England versus France and Spain. Like, it's going to look a little different because of all the governmental contexts that each of those countries and women in those countries, for example, are operate within. For example, in Italy, the women's league, although they're Serie A, and you have a fully professionalized men's league, by governmental law, the women in Italy are amateur. So that's a unique dynamic where you're not dealing with that so much in the UK. So we're trying to work out what global labor standards can look like in various contexts and circumstances. So when we move that into more federation-based conversations, we actually, because the way FIFPro works is that we're the global body, kind of like FIFA is, and then we have member unions underneath us, similar to the member federations of FIFA. So, for example, I'll take the UK. Our member union in the UK is the PFA. So we work directly with the PFA, who are working with the FA regarding these issues and these standards. So that's kind of how the relationship works. Now, it doesn't stop us from having conversations with anybody, but we certainly respect and engage with our unions to help drive those more local domestic football conversations regarding the calls to action in the report. So yeah,
thank you.
Federations. Oh, wait. And then innovation. Well, speaking of innovation.
And this is a question for Laura too, before Ebru comes and cuts us off. Last answer. How can we innovate our way out of this COVID pause?
Oh, wow. That's a tough one, isn't it? I think, carry on doing some of the great things we were doing in the women's game before. But I think we need to amplify our voice. We need to come together more. The fact that, we all have national associations and confederations is great, but let's get some kind of manifesto for the women's game that we can all sign up to, because I don't think we're far apart. I think generally we all know what's needed in the women's game, and if we can articulate that and amplify it, I think it's such a compelling case. My optimism tells me that nobody can possibly challenge us on it, but let's wait and see on that, I guess.
Vandy, your ideas for innovation? You're never short of ideas. Come on.
Innovation. I
Don't
think
be shy.
I really honestly, I feel like we've created a pretty good blueprint with the Raising Our Game report and the labor standards. I really would encourage people to go read them. They're on page, I think, 96 in our report, and start to detail out some real action items that we together can incorporate into global football. But I'm just going to underline what Laura said, and kind of the construct of this conversation has been about whether it's creating a manifesto, whether it's coming together in a governance capacity to make sure that we're shaping the future of women's football together, and make sure that the voices are at the table of people who both live and experience football, women's football on a day-to-day basis. I think that's going to be a critical component to it.
Well, as a final thought, I loved what Lewis FC did. They said, if we reduce prices and expect little from the women's team, then that's what we'll get. But we assume away the solution if we do that. all you do is send a signal that you don't value it. So they raise prices, they quadruple their attendances at the same time for women, and now it's about even for the men's and the women's teams. So the challenge is, I suppose, for the clubs at the next level up and the next level up to try and do the same thing, and really pitch the value of the women's game as it should be. But I think Ebru is about to give me a yellow card, or maybe a red one. So I think
I can
I better hand back to
never
you.
give you a yellow card, my dear. What a wonderful, wonderful conversation it was. Thank you, Moya, Amanda, Laura. I could have listened to you for hours and hours, and we must do this again for sure. And thank you for reminding us of the core values of what football was before it became more about shareholder value and mega events and, you know, financial cliffs and big profits. And so I think I agree a lot with Laura when she says that we should stick to the core values and promote them better, because men's football can't really deliver or match in any way in those values and delivery of the values. And I agree with Amanda that we're actually in a lucky position because we have a chance to redesign or completely design from scratch the governance model of women's football, because we're still at the maybe early stages of the global professionalization, and our impatience comes from long years of waiting. But if I might just quickly remind you that when the Premier League was set up back in '92, it took them almost 8 years before they started having foreign players, another 8 years before international investments came in, another 10 years before international viewership started building up. So within its first year of the establishment, Barclays, FA, WSL actually did a great job. And I have no doubt that the growth rates will be exponential and will be quickly back on our feet with the right governance structures, with the right partners, with the right sponsors, and of course the greatest minds around the table and all the stakeholders contributing to this recovery, equilibrium, and growth. So thank you again for taking the time to talk to us today, and for all those wonderful participants who were with us to listen. And your comments are well taken, and we will come back to all those if we weren't able to answer your questions in time. So stay well, stay safe, and stay with Women in Football and all these wonderful women here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.